Yeah, I'd like to welcome some of you who haven't been here for a while. Dave and Helen, and Terry and Gary, and Sandy, you brought your friend Linda. It's really nice to have you guys here this morning. And Aaron, you too as well. Lord, as we look in your word today, I ask that you would encourage us and inspire us. You'd help us again to see you clearly, to see who you really are and how much you care about us. And we ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. We all know people who have no respect or love for the Bible. They don't trust anything in it. And what's amazing to me is how often they quote from the Bible that they don't believe in. And you say, well, what do you mean? I'll just give you a couple examples. You've heard the phrase, well, he's a wolf in sheep's clothing. That actually comes from Matthew 7:15. We don't see eye to eye. That comes from Isaiah 52:8. Someone's putting words in my mouth. That comes from 2 Samuel 14:3. You don't want to mess with the powers that be. That comes from Romans 13:1. We should go the extra mile, which is Matthew 5:41. He's a fly in the ointment. That comes from Ecclesiastes 10:1. Eat, drink, and be merry. Ecclesiastes 8:15. And there's another one's going to bite the dust. That's Psalm 22:9. And I mean, there are lots more. There's a huge list. People use the Bible not even realizing what they're doing. And there's one more expression that we're going to look at today, and that is the handwriting is on the wall. It comes from Daniel chapter 5, where we'll be. And when we use that phrase, we usually mean by it, well, this is obvious. Everybody can see what's happening here. This is obvious. But the truth of the matter is, the handwriting on the wall was not obvious. No one could figure it out, well, except for one person, our friend Daniel. And we'll get to that in a minute. So we're going to be in Daniel chapter 5, and we're going to start with verse 1, and we're 8 or 9 years after where we were in chapter 8. Remember I told you we're teaching this chronologically, not in the order that it's written in the Bible. So this is after Daniel's 2 visions and his 2 dreams that told about the empires that would come, some that have come and gone for us, and some that are still remaining yet in the future. He told us a lot about the little horn, the Antichrist, and what he will do at the end of the time, and there will be more of that before we're done with Daniel. But now we're later on in the story, and we're coming to the end of the empire of Babylon. So in chapter 5, verse 1, Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. This is really fascinating. We've mentioned the fact that there are a number of critics of Daniel who say this book could not have possibly been written. There's too many things that he could have only known after the fact, and there's mistakes in this book, and one of them is Belshazzar. There is no such person. You look at all the writings in Babylon and history documents, this man's name is never found one time. Well, that was until the mid-1800s when a ziggurat was excavated, and that's one of those rectangular buildings that's kind of stepped up that makes like a Tower of Babylon, that kind of a thing. And when it was excavated, there were 4, and they look like this. They're rolled scrolls made out of stone, and each one of those said something about the fact that the king of Babylon is rebuilding this temple. And as he's rebuilding it, and his name was Nabonidus, he was rebuilding this temple, and as he rebuilt it, this is in commemoration. They wrote information on these scrolls and put it in the 4 corners. Well, this is one of the scrolls, and it says on it literally that he is dedicating this to Belshazzar, his firstborn son. So he is named by his father, the king, and history records this for us. And this picture is not as bright and clear as you might think. The lights on it don't help very much. This is in absolutely impeccable shape. I mean, there's no mistaking what it says on there. And what's interesting to me is usually we think of someone that doesn't trust the Bible. They have an objection. And you answer their objection. Well, here it is. This is proof that this guy did exist. And you think, well, okay, maybe I should reevaluate here. Maybe I should look at the Bible more carefully. Maybe I should trust in it. I had an objection, but there he is. It's been satisfied. It doesn't work that way. For those people who do not want to believe, no amount of proof or evidence is enough. It's never sufficient. The critics just pass that one by and will go to the next point of contention, and they will always have another one. They're not willing to trust the Bible, and it's always about their own choice. So verse 2, when Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and the silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple. And by the way, that's his grandpa. And in the culture, they do that, and the Jews did the same thing. They'd say Father Abraham, when actually he might be generations back. Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold, of silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, he knew where these vessels had come from. He knows the story. I mean, he's his grandpa. His grandpa is a very famous man. He has quite a story to tell. And you would think that he would have paid more attention to some of the stories that his grandpa told him. But he didn't. Those vessels which came from God's temple, they're holy, they're set apart for the service of the one true God, who his grandpa, I really believe, came to know personally. And he's mocking the God of heaven by not only using these, but using them for his wives and concubines. This is a party feast, and these are the party tokens. These are instruments that came out of God's temple. And why is he so confident that he's secure and that he can get away with this? Well, because the city of Babylon, and this map gives you a little bit of an idea. You see this kind of dark orange-red border that goes around the city. This is 17 miles long. The walls are 90 feet high. They're 20 feet thick. They've got guard towers all along. The gates, which you see where the roads go in and out of the city, they're cast out of bronze. They're metal gates. This city was considered impregnable, that no one could take this. And the Medo-Persian Empire is expanding. They are on the verge of capturing Babylon. They're surrounding the city, but they're partying inside because we are safe and secure. Nobody can uproot us. That's their thinking. I can do whatever I want. Which brings an interesting question. Can we mock God with impunity? Will there be a consequence to mocking him? Well, in this case, we're going to see, yeah, there is. And we won't, it doesn't actually tell this in the Bible, so I'll just give this a little bit of the story, throw it in right here. It turns out that when the army of the Medes and the Persians came against this city, they dammed up the Euphrates River. You can see the river runs right through the middle of the city. So they had food stored and they had a constant supply of water. They could have held out for a very long time. But the army diverted the water, not all of it, but most of it. History tells us that the water that was left was only thigh high on a man. So they could wade underneath the gates where the river ran through. They entered the city by night by surprise. They captured the city without a battle. In fact, history records that for 4 or 5 days after the Medes and Persians captured Babylon, there were still people in the city who didn't know that the rulership had changed. Because there was no fighting, there was no war. Only people that died were in Belshazzar's court, which there is some justice there, I think. So, verse 5. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. Some of you have King James, and I think it reads, his loins were loosed. Jonah, do you know what that might mean? His loins were loosed? It means what you're thinking. He soiled himself, or I could literally say he pooped his pants. He was so terrified, he lost all control. His knees were knocking together. We all know when we have done something wrong. God has given us a conscience. And we can go our own way against our conscience if we want. And the same thing is true of those people who do not have a relationship with God or those that do. In fact, if we turn to 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 19, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 19, Paul writing Timothy writes, we're to fight the good fight, keeping faith and a good conscience, which some have rejected. There's always that choice. You can obey your conscience or you can go your own way, do what you know is wrong. And suffered shipwreck in regard to their faith. Among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan so that they will be taught not to blaspheme. In other words, God has given us a conscience for good reason, to help guide and control our steps. And if we don't listen and we go against our conscience, whether either to do the things that we know we're not supposed to do or to not do those things we're supposed to do, there will be consequences. In the case of these two men, they've been turned over to Satan. You see, God doesn't want to allow us to live in that manner. He's going to force us to face the truth and to own up to our position. And we are now to that point with Belshazzar. Verse 7. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple, which is the color of royalty, and have a necklace of gold around his neck, probably not just a necklace, but an insignia that people would recognize that he has authority, and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Why only third ruler in the kingdom? The real king, Belshazzar's father, has taken an army and he's gone to Arabia. He was going to enlarge his empire, and he liked it in Arabia and decided he would stay. So he left Babylon in charge of his son, Belshazzar. And at this moment in history, he's probably been captured already by the Medo-Persian Empire because they're just overrunning everything. But at this point, the third position is the only one available, because there's the king who's in Arabia, and there's his son Belshazzar who's on the throne, who is second in command. So the best that Daniel can be offered is third place. So that's why it says he's the third in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. Now, in case you don't remember, this sounds a whole lot like chapter 2 when Nebuchadnezzar also could find no one to interpret his dream. He wanted to know what was going on, and he couldn't find anyone among the wise men that could do it. But there was someone that could give Nebuchadnezzar an answer. And someone that was there that remembered it is in verse 10. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. Now, when it says queen, you could say queen mother or queen grandmother. This is most likely Nebuchadnezzar's wife. Now, if you understand living with someone, a transformation in a man's life, a man who is filled with pride, who is arrogant and boastful, and then you see him completely humiliated, eating grass like a cow for 7 years in the field, and then see him restored again and him giving praise and glory to God, you might also believe in that God. And she's not one of the people that's feasting and using the implements from the temple as drinking goblets and vessels. She's not there, but she knows what's going on, and she says, in verse 10, she enters the banquet hall and she says, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom. I know this man. I know that's what she's thinking. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And then in the days of your father, actually grandfather, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conquerors, Chaldeans, and diviners. This is in sharp contrast to what we read in Daniel chapter 2, verse 25, where Arioch, who's the commander that's in charge of Daniel, Arioch runs into the king and hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows, I have found a man who can give you the answer. We don't need to puff ourselves up and be boastful and bragging about what we've done. As Arioch did, we can be more like the Queen Mother who just said, there is a man. She doesn't say, I can bring the man in. She just said, there is a man. I've seen him in action. You should listen to him. And so, verse 12. This was because an extraordinary spirit knowledge, insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. We have to remember, too, Daniel said one more thing. When he was brought in before Nebuchadnezzar and he interpreted his dream, he said, hey, this is not because I'm anybody special. I'm just a man who is going to do what God requires me to do. As a matter of fact, let me read this. This is chapter 2, verse 30. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me. This is Daniel speaking. For any wisdom residing in me. He says, I'm not anybody special, more than any other man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king so that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. This is the position God wants us to be in. He wants to use us. But it's not about us. It's about him. We are just servants. We're vessels. We're tools that he uses to explain things more clearly to those around us. And that's what Daniel is going to say here again. In verse 13. Daniel was brought before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who was one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? You have to ask yourself, why wasn't Daniel already here? Wasn't he one of the head wise men under Nebuchadnezzar? Yeah, he was. In fact, he was put in charge of all kinds of things. But that was 70 years ago. The time of the captivity is nearly up. Daniel was a young youth when he was taken from Israel into Babylon and put in the king's service. He might be 85 years old now. He certainly could have been retired. Certainly as an old person, we don't give old people much respect, which is not that good a deal for most of us in here, but that's common, to disregard what old people have to say, put them out to pasture, that kind of thing. Well, Daniel still knows his God. And even though he might be old, he is not out of the loop. In verse 14, Belshazzar says, now I have heard about you, that the Spirit of God is in you, that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Now I've heard. If you don't catch a little sarcasm in my voice, how did he not know that this is what Daniel is like? His grandpa knew personally the ministry that Daniel had and knew Daniel's God. And he has heard these stories. He's chosen to ignore it. Remember in Romans it says those who suppress the truth? There's a choice that's been made. We can choose to follow and pursue the truth that God reveals to us, or we can ignore it and push it aside, and he's pushed it aside. But Grandma has just come in and reminded him. And now he's, okay, I'm thinking things through again. I have heard that the Spirit of God is in you. And in verse 15, just now the wise men and conjurers were brought in before me that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. Just like Nebuchadnezzar. All the wise men can't solve the problem that the man of God is able to do in the Spirit of God. Verse 16, but I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple, wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. So he's promising him riches and power. And even if Daniel accepted, it's only going to be for a few hours. This is going to be a short-lived reign because judgment is about to happen. And Daniel, interestingly enough, he doesn't care about the money. He didn't ever serve God in order that he could be rich and famous. That was never his mind. In verse 17 we read that. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself, or give the rewards to somebody else. I don't need that. I don't want that. I have what I need. I have the relationship with my God. However, he says, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. It's interesting that the queen mother said, bring him in. He's going to tell you. She knew and had faith and trust in Daniel. And I think it was well placed because she'd seen him in action before. Verse 18. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Isn't this interesting? Jesus always did this. He often did this as well. People would ask him a question. Did he answer the question? No. He goes on a side road. We're going to get a history lesson here. God wants us to know why the things that are happening to us are happening. He's not going to keep Belshazzar in the dark. So here comes the history lesson. Verse 19. Because of the grandeur which this is God, bestowed on him, Nebuchadnezzar, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished he killed, whomever he wished he spared alive, and whomever he wished he elevated, and whomever he wished he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Belshazzar, you know better, because God gave you an example of what pride looks like and what its end looks like. You knew better. We read, and we've read this several times in the New Testament, that these things are written for our example. We're to pay attention to the things that God has given us here, because they're guides for our well-being and our safety. And if we go our own way and we let pride, we are all prone to be capable of falling from pride. If we let pride have its way in our life, pride comes before the fall. There will be some kind of judgment. There will be destruction. In verse 22, yet you, his son, Belshazzar, and by the way, when Belshazzar calls Daniel by his Hebrew name, what does Daniel mean in Hebrew? Does anyone remember? El is the word for God. So what is Dan? Judge. God is my judge. When Belshazzar calls Daniel by his Hebrew name, he is literally pronouncing, God is my judge on himself. Isn't that one of those little quirky ironies God is so good at doing? Yet you, his son Belshazzar, you have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. He has sinned against his conscience. He knew better. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. How could that be more obvious than taking the holy implements, the things that have been set aside to worship God, and use them as party favors? And they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines, have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and of gold and bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, they do not hear, they do not understand. Why are you doing this? How stupid could you be? But the God in whose hand your life and your breath and all your ways, you have not glorified. We give credit to all these things that have no influence and no impact on what's really going on, and yet we ignore the God who is there. As Francis Schaeffer said, he is there, and he is not silent. He's going to speak. Verse 24, then the hand was sent out from him, and this inscription was written out. Okay, Belshazzar, this is how we got to where we are today. This is not an accident. This is a deliberate choice that you made that now is going to be resolved. The God whom you mocked, he's now going to speak. So, verse 25 through 28. I've been waiting for a long time to get to this part of this book of Daniel. Now, this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom, put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. Now, before we talk about what this means, I want to say something that I think is really valuable and important for us. There are many people that think there are no codes in the Bible. John MacArthur's one, says they don't exist. Now, I disagree with that, but I want you to understand something that is important. No plain and simple interpretation of the text will ever be changed by some code that we might find, some deeper insight or meaning. The plain and simple meaning of this passage Daniel gives us right now: numbered, weighed, divided. This kingdom is over. Belshazzar, your reign is over. That's the plain and simple meaning of this passage. God's time of judgment, his patience is run out. His judgment is now at hand, and that's what's going on. But I have one of these curious minds. What did Daniel actually see? How did he know that's what it meant? Well, that's what we want to look at. And this is, hopefully this will be interesting. And I know you can't see this very well. This is a painting in the 1600s by Rembrandt. And you can see Belshazzar here, and up, and this is the party scene, and up on the wall, you see the writing on the wall, and you see the hand here that is writing on the wall. Now, when he painted this painting, he used what was taught by the rabbis at the time, that the writing was vertically. So it would be rows and columns. It could either be 5 rows of 3 or 3 rows of 5. This is what I mean by that. These are the words in Hebrew that Daniel is interpreting for us. And I know most of you don't know any Hebrew, so I'll give you a little bit of a quick rundown. If we read vertically like this, each one of these, like this is Mem, Nun, Aleph. This is Mena, and the next one again, Mena, and here we have Tav, Kaf, and Lamed. So this would be Tekel, and this is Ufar Sen. This last letter on the bottom on the left is actually what we would call an in, just like this second letter is an in. They look different because Hebrew has a different form for some letters at the end of a word. This is one of those. So what do we see here? Many, Tekel, Ufar Sen. This is what Daniel tells us was written on the wall. Now, we don't read Hebrew, but if we read this top line tells us something. And this is very interesting. If we focus just on these 2 letters right here, this Mem and this Tav, the Hebrew word for death is Muth. And if we think back in Genesis chapter 5, Methuselah, Muth is in his name, and his name literally means his death shall come. When we look back now at these 2 letters right here, back now again at this, the word for death, Muth, is a noun, but the verb form is this, Mem Tav. It's the Hebrew word dying or about to die. When Daniel looked and saw that on the wall right away, he knows somebody's going to die. And what does that line actually read? This is that same line we just looked at across the top of our rows and columns. The one putting him to death. In Hebrew, that's what that actually says. The one putting him to death. And interestingly, if you read that same line backwards, it reads, the one who encodes. The one who's putting him to death is the one who encodes. Now, just for my own curiosity, I got a modern Hebrew dictionary and just looked this word up in this order. And it reads, clogging up or shutting up, which is a picture of somebody encoding something. It's not something that's obvious or visible. So right away, Daniel knows that someone is going to die, Belshazzar, and he's going to die at the hand of the one who's writing on the wall, who's behind that. And who's that? Well, it's God, of course. And if I go back here, one more time. There's one more thing in here, and this is curious. I tell you what, there are some people who believe that every code that's ever found in the Bible is represented in this, and you're going to have to spend your own time investigating. But this is a circle of letters that's around 3 letters in the middle. Those 3 letters in the middle are also another Hebrew word, and they say, go around. So not only did Daniel read the top line from right to left and left to right, he sees here, go around. And as you go around the circle, we're not going to go all the way around the circle. There's a lot more information that could be gathered here. But this next letter, as you go around, Remember, Hebrew is read right to left, so you go across the top and you go around. The next letter is the Yod. And if you remember the name of God, Yod He Vav He, Yah is an abbreviation and a representation of the name of God. Who is this that's writing on the wall? Who is this going to be responsible for taking Belshazzar's life? It's the God of Israel, the God who he's mocking. It's not an accident, and it's not a mistake. Now, some of you might be saying, okay, that's all really curious, but how do you know for sure? This is an interesting thing to consider. Daniel could see what was on the wall, and so could the rest of the room, but nowhere in the text is what was written on the wall actually specified for us. What is written on the wall, or what we read in the Bible, is what Daniel interpreted that was on the wall. So what could have been on the wall? This is called an atbash. It's a simple code that is in the Bible, and it gets its name from this. In the yellow box that's on the top, we see 4 Hebrew letters. And by the way, across the top, this is half of the Hebrew alphabet, and across the bottom, here's the other half. There's 22 letters. There's 11 on the top and 11 on the bottom. What happens here is, in an atbash, in order to obscure what the writing says, you use the letter that's opposite in the line. So instead of an aleph, you would write a tav if you're using atbash code. And that's where atbash comes from. Aleph, tav, and then bet, sheen is atbash. That's where we get the name atbash for the code. Now, you say, is this ever found in the Bible anywhere? Yes, we're going to turn, because I want to show you that this is something Jeremiah the prophet used. In Jeremiah chapter 25, in verse 26, we read this. All the kings of the north, near and far, one with another, and all the kingdoms of the earth which are upon the face of the ground, and the king of Sheshach shall drink after them. Now, who is the king of Sheshach? If you look in the context of this passage, we're talking about Babylon. And everyone says, well, that's a really common name for Babylon. It was never used in Babylon by any of the Babylonians to talk about their own country. Never. It's only found in the writings of Jeremiah, the Hebrew prophet. Sheshach. Well, what is Sheshach? If we use the atbash, this atbash here, this is Babylon would be bet, lamed. The top right letter in the yellow box and the far right letter on the second line. Babel. That's the word for Babylon. So what is its atbash? It would be below the bet, it'd be sheen, and then above the lamed, it would be the kaf, the k sound. Sheshach. What Jeremiah is doing, and if you know anything about Jeremiah, for 40 years he proclaimed all kinds of doom and gloom because people were not obeying God. And he prophesied doom on Babylon, and yet he's living in an area under Babylon's control. Even his own people didn't love him. They didn't respect him. He was commanded not to marry, so he was alone. He's called the lonely prophet. He was called the weeping prophet. Nobody listened to his messages. He was rejected everywhere he went. He was punished, tortured. He was put in prison. He was beaten. He didn't have the best life. And he did not want to poke Babylon in the eye and incur even more wrath. So when he wrote about Babylon's troubles, he wrote Sheshach instead of Babel. So we know that this was in here. And not only that, Jeremiah has been dead over 40 years at the point that we are in our story in chapter 5, the handwriting on the wall. And Daniel, what is he? He was smart. We read in chapter 2 that he had wisdom in all kinds of literature. He knows what Jeremiah's written. He knew who Sheshach was. When he saw this writing on the wall, the first thing he recognized, Atbash. So this is what was on the wall. Instead of rows and columns, this is all in a row. This row of black letters, again reading from right to left, Yud, Tet, Tav. Yet. What is that? Well, that's gibberish. No one could understand what was written on the wall, because if it was in Atbash, it would have looked like this, and these are not words. This is gibberish. But Daniel could look at this and say, wait a minute, the Yod is the Atbash, that's Mem. The Tet that's Nun, and the Tav is the Aleph. This is Mina, Tekel, Farse. Now, this is not Upharsin like we read in the text earlier. The U just means and in Hebrew, and the ending of this just makes it plural. This is the singular. Daniel says, oh, I know what this is. I've seen this before. I've seen it with Jeremiah the prophet. This is what it means, O king. Your kingdom has been measured and weighed and divided. It's over. And I know someone's going to die tonight, and I know they're going to die at the hand of the God of Israel. Now, there's a lot more to this message. I'm not going to do any more. We don't have time this morning anyway. But those 4 letters, many, tekel, parse, are also coins. And the coins have a numerical value. And there are some people that have looked at that and determined that this is a prophecy about Christ, his betrayal for 30 pieces of silver. If you want to explore that, have at it. There's just no limit to the depth that God will do things in his word to catch our attention. He puts breadcrumbs out there. I love the term breadcrumbs because he's the bread of life, and he's telling us, follow my trail. We saw in Esther that the name Esther means God is hidden. Stir is hidden, and Aleph, that first letter in the alphabet, the one on the top left, that's the symbol for God, the Father, and so God is hidden. But we saw that in the text, there are letters that are majuscular. There are 5 occurrences of 4 consecutive words in Esther in which one letter is bigger in each word than all the rest of them in the line. And what do you see when you see those letters? God is saying, wait, pay attention here. There's something in here. And what were those letters? They were the letters Yod He Vav He, the picture of Jesus Christ. That's the name of God 4 times in the book of Esther. And the 5th time, it's the picture of I am. It's the name God gave to himself when Moses asked him in the burning bush, who are you? He said, I am that I am. And someday we have to explore that word, because it's not only I am, it's I was, I am, and I will be. It's all in that word. So it's another breadcrumb. We can know that God is doing things like this, and it's not going to change the meaning of the text, but it's going to give us a much better picture of who our God is and what he's really doing. So what does this have to do with let's go back to Daniel. We've got a couple more verses to go. Daniel chapter 5, verse 29 and 30. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as their 3rd ruler in the kingdom. And this is the shortest reign in history. Verse 30, that same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So judgment has come, swift and sure. That's the way our God is. He's ultimately very patient with us. But in the end, there will be justice. Who is the Darius the Mede here? And this is the Medo-Persian Empire. So this can't be Cyrus. Remember, Cyrus had 2 parents. One was a Mede and the other one was a Persian. So he's not a Mede. He's the head of the whole empire. This Darius, which is a name given several times throughout the Bible to different people, this is one of his generals who's in charge of actually the conquering of the city of Babylon. History tells us that, like I said, they was taken without a fight. People didn't even know what had happened. Within a matter of days, Cyrus actually entered Babylon himself. And when he entered Babylon, he was met by Daniel, who carried a letter for Cyrus. Now, we looked at part of this letter before, but I want to go back to Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1. We just want to read one verse. This is the letter that Daniel greets the king of the Medo-Persian Empire when he comes into Babylon, the last great fortress to be conquered by them. He reads, this is the letter to Cyrus. Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed. This isn't written for you or me. This was written and put here, well, it is for us, but it was written for Cyrus. And it says, whom I have taken by the right hand to subdue nations before him. He just conquered Babylon. And to loose the loins of kings. What did Belshazzar do? He pooped his pants. How can I Chris is waving, so he soiled himself. There are not two more unlikely or improbable prophecies that could ever be given to anyone. That you're going to conquer a kingdom and that king is going to mess his pants. How could you possibly know something like that? Well, you could only know that if the God of Israel is really the one that's in charge of you being that ruler. This was written long before Cyrus was even born, and it calls him by name. So what does he do? Cyrus immediately gives the Jews permission to go back to Jerusalem. 50,000 people, as we saw when we studied Esther, went back right away. But that didn't really cost him anything because that's still part of his kingdom. So he's just moving some people from here over to here. So that's no big deal, right? But he funded the temple project. This cost him something. He paid the Jews to rebuild their temple. Why did he do that? He got a picture of God in action. He knows who's responsible for his being a king and for his victories. He's not making the mistake that Belshazzar made of being prideful and boastful. It's all about me, which is the same thing his grandpa had said at one point. It's all about me. I'm Nebuchadnezzar. I'm the most powerful man in the world. So is there a lesson for us in here? Yeah, I hope there is. We need to trust in God and not in ourselves. Humility is a good thing. To recognize that what God is doing in our lives is his business. To just be like Daniel, not take credit for ourselves, like the queen mother who didn't take credit. Look, I'm not telling you I have the answer, but I know this guy over here who does. It's pointing everyone to God. That's the bottom line. That's what God wants us to do. And in the end, there will be justice. So if things are not going well right now, just be patient. God is very patient, but he will see perfect justice done to everyone. Perfect justice. Next week, we'll see the fiery furnace. We'll see that Daniel's tests and trials are not the fiery furnace, the lion's den. The trials are not over yet. He's going to be fed to the lions for being faithful and following God. That'll end up be another interesting story. Lord, again, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the encouragement that you've given it and the instruction that you give us. We are to pay attention to what you've written in your word. There are warnings in there and directions that are not just suggestions, Lord. There are things that we need to take seriously because you are a serious and just God. You're very patient with us, and I thank you for that. And I pray you continue to, by our consciences, lead us to do right and to please you, and by that, show the surrounding world who you are, because that's one of the main reasons we're still here. And we'll give you the praise and honor and glory for it. And everybody said, amen.